Well, hello, buddy. So good to see you. My name's Nate. If I haven't met you, I want to say hi to everybody online. We're so happy you joined us as well, especially if you are a guest. I know it can be absolutely terrifying to step into a church the first time or to tune in for the first time, so thanks for having the courage to do that. We celebrate what we call being spiritually unresolved. If you're here and you're trying to figure out what you believe, we hope this is a safe place. We're totally biased, but we're open to everybody's process as well. So thanks for being here. Hey, we are in week number 3 of the series. We're calling it Hunting the Hypocrite. Now here's the main idea behind it is we're not looking for hypocrite. We're looking internally. And we're saying, how can we, to the best of our abilities, look internally so that we can live consistent lives? Consistent lives. We began this series in Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus, who's known for his loving, kind, graceful words, looks at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the most religiously earnest, devout people you could imagine. And he says, you have got it all wrong. And he calls them hypocrites. Whole chapter, Matthew 23. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek word hypokrisis, which means to be an actor. It means that you're pretending to be someone that you really aren't. That's what they called an actor in the Greek language, is a hypokrisis. And Jesus says, here's what you've gotten wrong, is you thought that pleasing God, you thought that being religious was all about creating a persona that was impressive. And Jesus says, I don't care about that. I care about what is happening inside of you. Put your attentions on internal continuity and strength rather than external. And he uses this illustration. He says, you're like a cup that looks clean from the outside, but inside is filthy. He says, start working on the inside. And we recognize this, that the first step for me to leave my hypocrisy behind is this. I have to believe that God loves me as I am. And that is, that's one thing to say. It is another thing to actually believe. We typically think this, well, God loves who I could be. God loves the good parts of me. And if that's what I believe, then I am always going to be presenting a mask, trying to be someone I'm not, hoping that God will accept me. If you want to live a consistent life, believe this. Like it's a core of your being. God loves you as you are. He loves me as I am. He loves me so much, he'll never let me stay where I'm at, but he loves me. And then creating communities where it's okay not to be okay. Where I don't come to church or I don't come to a small group and be like, hi everybody. Instead it's like, this is who I am and I am in process, and if you're okay with that. Last week we looked at this. Jesus uses 2 illustrations. He talks about trees that bear fruit and trees that don't. And then he says the second one is houses that withstand the storms of life and those that don't. And he says, here's the only difference. He said, both people hear my words, but the person who hears my words and puts them into practice will be like a tree that bears fruit or like a house that survives storms. The hearing, knowing, the goal of Christianity is not to know as much as possible. The goal of Christianity is to obey, to hear Jesus' words and put them into practice. And when I do that, Jesus says, you put down roots, you have a foundation, you survive the storms. It's not about building a facade. Is about building depth, and I build depth through hearing Jesus' words and putting them into practice. So here's where we're gonna go this week. We're gonna look at the same chapter we did last week, a little bit earlier in the chapter, Luke chapter 6, where Jesus gives some very, very vivid illustrations regarding living an authentic life. And he's gonna talk about this world of personal relationships. Okay, this is where hypocrisy really comes out, right? He says, I want to talk to you about experiences in life where you're offended, where you have a hard time forgiving someone, where you're condemned and when you're judged, or when you want to condemn or when you want to judge. And he's going to say some very, very contrarian things that they're not how my mind operates. They're not how my instincts tell me to behave. Okay, but Jesus, he's gonna use the word hypocrite and he's gonna give us these vivid illustrations. Let's read together. Luke chapter 6, we'll begin at verse 36. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Now, if you're looking in your own Bible, we've divided up the New Testament. In Greek, it's all just solid text. We've divided it into chapters and verses and headings, and this typically sits with the paragraph before it, but it's one thought, okay? So first thing he says, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. So this picture of excess, more than you need. For with the measure that you use it, it will be measured to you. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained, beautiful phrase that we'll talk about in a moment, fully trained, there's a process involved, will be like their teacher. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. There's the word. First, take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Okay, we read that text in full. We're gonna come through and we're gonna look at each one of these really vivid illustrations. So here's some principles for living an authentic life. Ready? Number one, it's the mercy principle. Jesus sets up this whole overarching principle over all human relationships. He says, be merciful like your Father in heaven is merciful. So here's what happens to human beings. Whether we want to or not, we become like the God that we worship. Okay, we become like the God that we worship. And I have to ask myself, do I fundamentally believe that God is merciful? Because this is what Jesus says. In your human interaction relationships, I want you to be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. But if at the core of who I am not sure that God is merciful, I won't be able to emulate him, will I? So we come with all our baggage, right? Some of it is religious baggage. And some of us, you read through the Old Testament. Has anybody ever read through the Old Testament and go, that's not a very merciful God? Yeah. You're like, girl, you laughed because you read the same thing I did. Like, what? But this is what Jesus says. Overall, we don't always understand his ways, and there's this thing called justice as well. But he says, your Father is merciful. What he has given from heaven to earth has been ongoing, just wave after wave of mercy. But sometimes we have a mentality, we have an image of God that is anything but a merciful God. We often view God more like the god Zeus. You know, Zeus is typically portrayed in Roman and Greek images as he sits on a chair. He's really muscular for his age. He's got a long beard. You know what Zeus always has? He has an eagle over his right shoulder, and he's holding a lightning bolt because he is the God of judgment. And he's just looking down. Oh, you naughty. Zap, right? If that's my conception of God, it's going to be really difficult for me to be a merciful person because I will become like the God that I worship. Jesus says, your God is merciful. And when you understand that, you begin to act in the midst of conflict like your God acts towards you in the midst of conflict you have with him. So that's the mercy principle. Here's the second principle. We're going to call it the training principle. The training principle. Let's read those verses again. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? A student is not above their teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. So here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, Unfortunately, I don't know where I'm blind, okay? But if I have this assumption that I've got it all together and I say, hey, follow me, but I'm not self-aware, I'm still inconsistent and unhealthy in my life, I'm gonna lead someone else towards danger. The blind can't lead the blind. But he says, here's what you can do. You can be fully trained. So I love this as we're introduced to this idea about being authentic. Jesus gives permission right now for this to be a process. A process, because this is the truth. In my life, okay, I've been following Jesus for, decades, right? And if you would have asked my 20-year-old self, hey, what will you be like when you're 50? I would think, oh man, I'll be so mature and I'll have all the garbage worked out of my life and I've got it together. And you know what is profoundly disappointing? I am still a piece of work. Like God is still having to identify things in my life. And that's why Jesus says, you have to be fully trained. This is a lifetime pursuit. I think hypocrisy sometimes enters our life when we think, okay, I've been a follower of Jesus for X amount of years, therefore I guess I have it all together now? No. I'm in the process of being authentic. I've mentioned this before, but I bet I wouldn't be surprised if this happens weekly in my life. I'll be talking to somebody about their own spiritual past. And they'll say this once a week. They'll say, you know what, I kind of like Jesus, but I had this bad experience at a church. I had a bad experience with a family member who said they were a Christian, and I just feel like Christians are hypocritical. I've heard that so much for so many years. You know what I do now? I go, you're so right. I work there. I am surrounded by hypocrites, and I'm one of them. But I said, here's the difference. In our community, we believe that we're hypocrites in recovery. And so we're all moving towards authenticity. We're all moving towards our interior and our exterior life matching up. But we believe that we need to be trained in this, and we're never giving up. And we're always saying, God, search me, try me, expose things that are lacking authenticity in my life. So who trains us? If Jesus says, unless you're fully trained, this is who trains us. It's Jesus in the last moments of his life, nailed to a cross, abandoned by his peers, wrongly accused of a crime, being executed for something that he did not do. Physical suffering beyond anything that we can even experience. Emotional suffering. And what does Jesus say from the cross? I know what I would have said from the cross. God, get him. Get him. Like, make this right. You ever read any of the Psalms? Where David, he has these Psalms where it's like, God, I pray that you would kill my enemies. And he actually uses the Hebrew word erase them from the planet. Just like, no longer exist. What does Jesus say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand. In the midst of the greatest suffering imaginable, what does Jesus give? He gives forgiveness. And Jesus says, you can't lead each other because you have to be fully trained. And that's the Jesus that I pray is training you and is training me, this training principle. Now, the third principle is the principle of reciprocity, okay? So that's not a word that we use very often, but here's a simple definition. What I sow, I will eventually reap, okay? The principle of reciprocity. What I sow, I will reap. And Jesus says this, he says, okay, if you judge, guess what you're gonna get in return? Judgment. If you forgive, what do you get? You get forgiveness. Let's reread these verses because it is exceptional what Jesus says here. Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because this verse My fellow pastors, it's just one of those things that drives me nuts. They use this verse out of context and try to apply it toward financial things. Okay, have you ever heard this preached about finances? Now, Paul does use this in the book of Corinthians, the same concept, referring to finances. But what does Jesus say? He said, it's not good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over in your new Mercedes, right? He's not talking about finances. He says, in my attitudes, in my forgiveness, in my condemnation, in my judgment, if I can sow the right things, here's what I'm gonna get. I'm gonna receive an abundance of forgiveness and mercy from other people. So much is poured into your lap. For with the measure that you use it, what is it? The measure I use to pour out forgiveness and mercy. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you. We've got to explore this because this is a pretty radical way of entering into human conflict. You ever had a boomerang? I had several as a boy. I tried to make my own. They always just flew like sticks. But ideally, in the movies, you throw a boomerang, it comes back. Right? That's reciprocity. It comes back. A seed. You plant, and then there's a delay, but eventually there's a harvest, and the harvest is directly correlated with your planting. So if I planted a few seeds, I reap a small harvest. If I planted lavish amounts of seed, I will reap lavish harvest. Okay, so this is the principle that Jesus is talking about. I want to illustrate this. So with the measure that you use it, it will be measured back to you. So when I am offended, here's 1 grain of rice. And I say, you know what? I'm gonna take one for the team. I'm gonna forgive you. You hear that? Here's what Jesus says. With the measure that you dole out, forgiveness, you're gonna get the same amount back. Or maybe we feel like, okay, you know what? I'm really growing. I am now giving out forgiveness by the teaspoon. Man, I've made a lot of progress. And that feels good, right? I didn't live according to my instincts. I wanted to return evil for evil. I wanted to get revenge, but I chose forgiveness. And look at that. Here's the good news. One day you're going to get that back. But what if my measuring went through a radical alteration and I began to say, I no longer dole out tiny bits of mercy. I believe that God is generous and he's always been generous with me. And I desire his generosity when it comes to mercy, when it comes to forgiveness. And rather than respond with judgment, I'm gonna pour out bucketfuls of mercy, bucketfuls of forgiveness. And Jesus says, what you want to understand is there is a direct correlation between what you give to people and what will come back to you. And then he takes the illustration farther, like this is full. And he goes, not only if you sow generously when it comes to human relationships and you forgive like Jesus forgave, he said, I'll give it to you pressed down, shaken together. He says, you want to receive a lot of mercy, running over, flowing into your lap. When I'm the one in need, what do I want? This is what I want. I'm like, I've got forgiveness everywhere. Everybody has mercy on me. And Jesus says, but if you're living life like this, that's all you can expect in return. But if you can live this radical new way where you look at human interactions and human relationships and you say, listen, I want to give you a tiny grain of forgiveness because that's all you deserve. Jesus says, What if you begin to sow the way God sows in your life? You're going to have an abundance. Pressed down, shaken together, running over. Change the measurement, Jesus says. It's the principle of reciprocity. Now, there's one final principle that I want us to look at, and we'll call it the plank principle. The plank principle. Now, Jesus uses, for us, it seems like a really awkward illustration. He's talking about sawdust in somebody's eye. Like everybody, you've had something in your eye, right? You get something in your eye and it's uncomfortable. Well, in the first century in Judaism, one of the things that they talked about, can you imagine life without a good mirror? Because if you got something in your eye, the first thing you do is you go to a mirror. Back then you had like a polished brass mirror and you can't see it and you're looking for it. So you eventually, if you can't find it, you need somebody else to identify it for you. Oh yeah, it's like an eyelash right in the corner. And so it became a metaphor for inconsistencies or sin in my life. It's like I've got a speck in my eye and I can't see it. So this is a common metaphor that's used. And Jesus takes this whole idea of sawdust or a speck in your eye. This is what he says. Let's reread the text for the plank principle. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, hey, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? Here's the word, you hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Okay, so here's our plank. Here's a tendency. This is what hypocritical people do. And listen, you guys, you're loved, but I think we have an incredible tendency to start looking for specks of dust in other people's eyes. We just do. This is what Jesus says. He goes, it's a principle that happens where, have you ever noticed this? An old mentor told me this. He said, Nathan, you gotta be careful in your life. He called me Nathan, by the way. He said, you gotta be careful in your life because you will always dislike people who sin differently than you sin. I'm like, what do you mean by that? So people that sin or have the same weakness I do, I usually have mercy for them because I totally understand. Oh yeah, I totally get it. You'll be fine, you'll be fine. But people who have different temptations, different failures in their life, those people I'm like, oh, naughty, like, I don't know what's going on with you. So Aiden, I'm sorry, you gotta come up here. He's one of our church planting apprentices, so I'm paying him, get up here. Okay, so Aiden, right? What if I looked at him and I thought, hey, Aiden, you've got some issues, some points. Yes, you're young, immature. There's some stuff in your life I think I could help you out with. And so I start looking and I'm like, oh, yeah. Start reaching my finger to his eye. Jesus says, you wanna know how silly that is? He says, here's your issue. You got a log, a plank sticking out of your eye. And so when I'm looking at Aiden and I'm like, hey, Aiden, come here. Let me help you with that. Let me help you. And here's what we can do. It is so easy. We start looking at culture. We start looking at people. And what do you see? Before you see your own plank, you see their specks of sawdust. And what happens when you have a plank sticking out of your eye and you try to help somebody with a speck in their eye? They're gonna get knocked out. They're really gonna have a problem. Jesus says, here's what I want you to do. All right, that's the hypocrite's way. Because here's my problem. I can't see this. I've had it with me since the beginning. It's grown over time. I don't even notice it. Jesus says, here's what I want you to be. You want to be a genuine follower of me? This is what I want you to be worried about. Not what your friend is doing. Not what your neighbor is doing. I don't want you to be an expert in other people's sins. I want you to be an expert in your own sin. I want you to be a logger for Jesus. I want your energies to be directed inward. I want you to say, God, I can't even see the planks out of my eyes. I've lived with them so long. I've learned to justify these things. God, would you show me? Would you identify what's inconsistent in my life, and would you help me to remove it? And day after day, year after year, decade after decade, Jesus says, let your attention be directed at what's in your own eye. Let God worry about what's in other people's eyes. It's not my job. Yes, we'll be honest. Yes, we'll be truthful. Yes, we'll have hard conversations. But my job is not to make you holy. That is God's job. My job is to say, God, would you help make me holy? Would you identify the things in my life I can't even see? I was thinking about things in your eye. I think it was my second date with my wife, Jenny. We started off rough. Our first date, we went horseback riding, and I caused one of the horses to go lame. And then our second date, she was a tennis player, and she said, well, we didn't know each other very well. She's like, hey, how about you meet with me and we play tennis? I was 16 years old, and I felt like I'm pretty athletic, and she's just a girl, it can't be that hard. So we go to play tennis, and I found a wooden racket in our garage. I didn't know that we were a couple decades past wooden rackets. It just looked like a tennis racket to me. So we show up, I'm ready to play tennis, and I realized this might not be easy during the warm-ups. Like, she knows what she's doing. Now I'm like, okay, let's play. First serve. I'm like, I don't even know how to hold the racket. She hits the ball right at me. Hard. Really hard. And I don't know that you're supposed to get out of the way. I just freak out and I try to block it. It skips off of the court. It pops me in my left eye. It's so fast, I don't even close my eye first. And then have you ever when you really scratch your eye, I'm just pouring tears. And this is a terrible date, and this is not good. So my parents said, you gotta go to the doctor, because I couldn't open it. I go to the doctor, and he's like, whoa, you scratched your cornea. How'd you do this? I said, well, I was riding bulls, and yeah. I didn't want to tell him. So the doctor says, you need to wear this patch over your eye for the next week. Do you know what it's like to go to high school with a patch over your eye, and everybody asks, how'd you do that? I was playing with this girl, playing tennis, and she hit me in the eye, right? That feeling, there's constantly something wrong I can't see. Jesus says, here's what I want you to do. Bring your issues. Bring your stuff. Let's not pretend that they don't exist. What if we focused our energies on, God, could you show me what's going on in here? Because I become so accustomed to my personal inconsistencies and my hypocrisy that I can't see them. Jesus says, come to me. Let me clarify, let me reveal, let me begin to remove, let me do the delicate job of bringing things that I never meant to be in your life out of your life, so that day by day, year by year, decade by decade, my vision is clarified as I'm being taught by the master of mercy and the master of forgiveness.